Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Grassroot Institute. Delighted to have you here today. I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute, and today we have a special speaker, John Dunham, who's going to talk about the Jones Act. Now, you've heard about the Jones Act quite a bit at Grassroot because it's a mainstay issue for us. It really is a set of laws that come to us from the 1920s, the Merchant Marine Maritime Act. And there are four things to remember about it as it deals with carrying cargo between United States ports. That is, carrying cargo between two U.S. ports like Honolulu and Hilo, or Hilo and Los Angeles. There are four things that have to occur. Number one, it must take place on a ship that has been built in the United States. Number two, owned by a U.S. company or U.S. citizens. Number three, largely crewed by U.S. citizens. And number four, very important, flagged with the United States flag. Now, little known to the founders of this law, these requirements over time have created a tremendous economic burden upon Americans that has cost our economy quite a bit and has damaged our shipbuilding industry. At one time, we were one of the largest shipbuilders on earth. Now we build approximately 1% or less of the deep bottom cargo ships every year. Our allies such as Japan, South Korea, Norway build far more ships than we do. And one of the things that has happened over that period of time since the 1920s is there's been a massive loss of jobs in the shipbuilding industry. Nonetheless, people defend the Jones Act on a couple of planks. The most prominent defense is that it's necessary for national security. And to that we say it definitely was at a time when it was important to be able to convert our merchant ships into military vessels, but we don't do warfare like that today. In the 15 minutes that it would take a nuclear warhead to get from North Korea to Honolulu, it's not likely that we're going to go down to the docks and ask all of the workers there to get on ships and head up to North Korea. That's not the way we do warfare. But nonetheless, there are people who value the Jones Act because of its historic national security plank. Another reason people value the Jones Act is because they believe it secures union jobs. What our analysis shows is that we've actually lost more jobs due to the Jones Act, similar to what happened in Detroit when there was high levels of protectionism put on foreign cars. At that time, we nearly killed the American automotive industry. It was the lifting of that protectionism that actually has led to the robust growth of the American automotive industry. So at the Grassroot Institute, as we look at this issue, we want to urge our government leaders to consider updating the Jones Act for the 21st century. How does that sound to you? Updating the Jones Act. Now you'll notice that that's not saying keep it the same. We think that it needs to be changed a little bit, modified. But it's not saying let's repeal it. In a perfect world, there probably wouldn't be a Jones Act because we wouldn't have protectionism at all. But we don't live in a perfect world, and there are certain purposes that the Jones Act has served. And at Grassroot, we want to work with those individuals who value the Jones Act, including members of certain political parties or persuasions, unions, ship industry members, and so forth. But we need to have a practical solution, and so we're going to be sharing a little bit more in 2000 about our solutions, one of them being one which you've seen popularized here in Hawaii as a modified reform by a gentleman named Michael Hansen, who is the president of the Hawaii Shippers Council, and that is, let's just update and reform the U.S. build requirement. Let's allow our commercial shippers and owners of ships to get their ships like the military does quite frequently from our allies. Ships that are built in Japan or South Korea or Norway that are faster, that are cheaper by far, that cost far less to maintain. That would help us in the industry to create a little more incentive for competition and improvement of the competitive environment, getting rid of a certain amount of protectionism. That's a good thing to do. That's what we mean by updating the Jones Act for the 21st century. Now, in order to get to the place where people are motivated, we have to have good researchers, good research. So we have been putting out some research and have been partnering with organizations like the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute on a national level. And Grassroot Institute is poised to increase our research portfolio as we go into 2019 and 2020. And that's one of the reasons we've struck up a relationship with a gentleman named John Dunham. Dr. Dunham is an economist who specializes in trade issues, and you've seen some of his work. He's done some breakthrough work on analyzing the Puerto Rico situation and helping Americans understand and not only Americans, but people across the world understand the costs of the Jones Act on Puerto Rico and the way it has in many ways debilitated their economy. One of the questions we're asking today is, could such a thing happen to Hawaii? He's the person to ask. He is an expert on taxes and on regulation. He's president of a well-known economics firm, John Dunham Associates, and was a senior economist for the New York City Mayor's Office and the Port Authority of New York. I'm going to give over the time to him, and then when he's done, I want to encourage you, come up to the microphone over here to ask your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm aloha to John Dunham. John.
Thanks. Is this on? Thanks so much.
You'll need to use this microphone.
I need to use this guy?
Or the handheld.
Okay.
Good to have you, John.
Great, thank you. All right, great. Thanks so much for having me out to Hawaii. I really appreciate, I like taking 15-hour flights from New York. And yesterday we were in Maui, and we somehow started a giant fire there, so we're hoping that that doesn't happen again today here. In fact, the Jones Act is really important to me, personally, because the last time I was in Hawaii, I was here with my wife, and we were on a cruise. We were sailing around the islands on a cruise ship, and that was one of 2 cruise ships that it actually had a Jones Act exemption. It was, the bottom was built in the United States, the hull, but the whole top of the ship was built in, I believe, Italy. My wife loves cruises, and we're kind of limited because of the Jones Act limiting passenger ships, which is a big part of this whole thing. So with that, I want to give you a modified presentation of what I gave in Puerto Rico. Our research is on the cost of the Jones Act in Puerto Rico. So we're going to try to apply that as best we can to Hawaii. So what is the Jones Act? Well, the Jones Act, first let's put some history to this. The Jones Act became law in the United States right after World War I. It was part of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And let's put this in context. When this law was enacted, prohibition had just begun in the United States. Just begun. This law was enacted the same year women were given the right to vote in the United States. It was 7 years before Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic. And I did a little research. It was 3 years after the last Queen of Hawaii passed away. So this was a long time ago. It was also the age of the flappers, the Great Gatsby, and that period. So I wanted to use some of their language in making this presentation. So you guys can guess what these terms mean, and as we go through it. But we're going to talk a little bit about the Jones Act and what it's done. We're going to talk about the research that we did in Puerto Rico and how the Jones Act's costing folks there. We're going to talk a little bit about the arguments that proponents of the Jones Act have made, and then we're going to follow it up with some conclusions. So with that, are we good? Okay. Now the main purpose of Senator Jones' amendment to the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 was to help lock in the trade between what was then the territory of Alaska to the Port of Seattle. Senator Jones was a senator from Washington. And in classic Washingtonese, this was passed, it was inserted into this bill, and nobody really thought at all about the unintended consequences of the Jones Act. If we can go one more. And this is the language that Senator Jones used to justify to justify this amendment. And you can see it's very important language, talking about national defense. It was really about protecting this Alaska trade, but we'll talk about national defense to make it important. And interestingly, these 1920 arguments are exactly the same arguments that are being used today by proponents of the Jones Act even though every single one of them has been proven to be untrue. This gives you a little bit of an idea of what has happened since the Jones Act was enacted. Just a few little statistics. I actually have a little more detailed ones here. So when the Jones Act was enacted, there were almost 3,000 merchant ships sailing under the U.S. flag. These are deep sea vessels. Today, there are 181 Jones Act eligible ships, 181 in the entire U.S. fleet. In 1920, when the Jones Act was enacted, almost 4 million tons of shipping was constructed in the U.S. In the last couple of years, I think 2 ships were built, under 300,000 tons in total. The U.S. flag fleet, in complete opposite of what Senator Jones wanted, is only carrying about 1.5% of all world cargo now. Most of that's oil. And in 1920, the American flag vessels numbered over 60,000 today. Employment on American flag vessels numbered over 60,000. Today, it's just 10,000. And if you think about that 10,000, that's including people like, anyone watch The Deadliest Catch here? Anyone? My wife loves The Deadliest Catch. It's like you watch these guys fish. It's bizarre, but it's interesting. Yeah. Sure. All of those vessels, all of those fishing vessels are American flag vessels. So this is including SIG in that 10,000 jobs. So as you can see from this, the Jones Act really has not done anything to meet the goals that were stated in 1920. So, in addition, the Jones Act has resulted in a huge number of unforeseen consequences to the economy of the country. The U.S. is one of the largest producers of natural gas in the world. In fact, I think it's the second largest producer after the country of Qatar in the Persian Gulf. And the U.S. is set to become a huge exporter of liquefied natural gas. But none of it is going to sail on U.S. ships because none of them exist. So it's all going to be sailed on foreign fleets. None can come to Hawaii, for example. The loss of shipbuilding in this country has also been very detrimental to the iron and aluminum industries, the 2 industries that the president is now trying to protect with tariffs. Bethlehem Steel in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, literally made steel for ships. That was their 90% of their business. Now that no ships are built, Bethlehem Steel's been gone. Cargo has to travel over land because there's the water shipping options are limited. Now this is really important domestically in the continental U.S. A lot more is traveling by truck and by rail than by water. And I'm going to show you a slide about that in a second. And as I talked about the cruise ships, there used to be hundreds of ships moving people back and forth across the U.S. waters, taking people from California to Hawaii, or taking people from New York to Savannah. Now there's virtually none. And finally, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, as well as the other U.S. outlying territories, have very limited shipping options, which has helped increase costs for production and costs of goods. So it's really been a detrimental thing. Here's a couple, pictures are worth 1,000 words in my book. And here's just a couple of graphics that show you what's happened since the Jones Act. Now this is when the Jones Act was enacted. This red line shows shipbuilding in the US. And you can see since the Jones Act was enacted, shipbuilding has basically collapsed, except for World War II. Now, I'm not going to say the Jones Act caused this to happen. There were other factors. But I'll tell you what, the Jones Act has done nothing to help increase shipbuilding. The blue line shows merchant marine employment. Again, this is everybody from people on deep sea vessels to SIG on the Northwestern on the Deadliest Catch. And you can see that the merchant marine has basically collapsed in the US as well. The next slide. This one shocked me, actually. I worked in the port industry for a long time, so waterborne cargo was always big on my mind, and I always thought there was a lot more of it than there is. But this is some statistics from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, and they show that waterborne cargo, and this includes the inland waterways, this includes the Mississippi, is virtually nothing compared to cargo transported over land. And generally speaking, transporting by water is the most efficient way to move stuff. But because we can't move stuff by water, because there's no ships, everything moves by land. And just as an aside, this is one of the reasons I think that the Jones Act has continued to live. One of the biggest supporters of Hawaii's own President Obama was Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett owns the Burlington Northern Railroad. And up until the Keystone Pipeline gets built, the Burlington Northern is the only way to transport oil from North Dakota, where the Bakken is, one of the biggest oil fields in the country, to refineries. It's the only way is by rail. And water is a great way to ship oil, but it just can't be done. And the statistics show exactly what's happened. So where are we now? Okay, let's know our onions. Let's know our onions. That's great. I love that phrase, know your onions. It means to be knowledgeable. This was a great flapper phrase. So I was asked to calculate the losses and the economic effects of the Jones Act on Puerto Rico. And it sounds like a really easy thing to do, but in fact, it's extremely difficult to do. Now, we came up with some really good models that I'll talk about in a second, but data on shipping costs is really, really hard to find. In fact, I think I can get the nuclear codes a lot easier than I could get data on shipping costs, and I'll guarantee you I can find out what it's at Area 51 a lot faster than I can find those shipping costs. So it is a really difficult thing. Most studies, including our own, use proxies, and in the end, there's really no undisputed data source for shipping costs. So we came up with a model that can we do? Great. We came up with a model not of the effects of the Jones Act, but a model of shipping to Puerto Rico. So what does it cost to move stuff from internationally, because I can get data internationally, to Puerto Rico? And we used a whole bunch of different data sources. We used Piers, which is a big data source for actual shipping information. We used tariff information. We used our model called IMPLAN, which is an input-output model that gives us production numbers. We used all of this data, and we put together a baseline shipping cost model for Puerto Rico that looked at about 300, I think roughly 300 different products. So how much does it cost in general to ship on average to ship grain to Puerto Rico, or canned tuna, or Dole pineapple? All these different things. And then with that model, we tested a whole bunch of different assumptions, a whole bunch of different scenarios. Now what's interesting is economists are great at building models, and we use a lot of assumptions to build those models. And that's just the way it is. Models are based on assumptions. They're maps of reality, not reality itself. What's interesting though is most economists don't share their models. They don't share their models, they don't share their data. We kept this model completely open. You can look in the guts of this thing. You can tear open the carburetor in this model and see what's in it. So it's a really open architecture model, and that's allowed some of the proponents of the Jones Act to actually question our assumptions. And a study just came out by Reeves and Associates, who works for the shipping lines. And I went through it, and honestly, they had some flowery language, but they didn't find anything wrong with the model itself. So I'm pretty sure we have a pretty robust model. So if we can do the slide, let's know some more onions. Now there's a lot of models. You can do a lot of different kinds of models of the Jones Act, and a lot have been done. This is, we reviewed an ungodly number of studies, I think 30 or 40 studies, and there were 12 that had actual data, that wasn't somebody else's data from another study. And those 12 studies showed that the differential costs of shipping, because of the Jones Act, ranged from a little over 20% to almost 100%. This gives you a kind of a graphic of the differential costs. You know, it's a tight bound. So it gives me an idea that there's differential costs, right? It's more expensive to ship because of the Jones Act. And we use this set of studies as just one of our scenarios. If we go to the next one. I'm just going to know our onions. I'm going to do my economics song and dance here a little bit. So our model is designed using all kinds of different data to come up with international rates. We aggregated everything to these commodity groupings, and then we ran different pricing differential scenarios through it. And then from those differentials, we ran the cost through the entire economy of Puerto Rico. So for example, if it costs more to import oil into Puerto Rico, well, you guys know this here, right? It costs more to import oil into Hawaii because you really can't import it from the United States. It has to come from abroad. Shipping costs are higher because the longer you charter a oil tanker for, the more it costs. That oil comes to Honolulu. It goes into a electricity plant making electricity. Because the oil is more expensive, your electricity is more expensive. Because your electricity is more expensive, it's more expensive to operate the air conditioning in this place. So the costs of renting this room are higher than they should be. And that's what we looked at across 334 separate commodities in Puerto Rico. And if we go one more. And then we ran a bunch of different scenarios. We ran a scenario that we developed based on public data sources that I'm pretty proud of. I think it really reflects the costs. We ran tariff information, and tariffs are basically garbage. There's really very little information in tariffs submitted by the shipping lines, but we use that information. Those 12 studies I showed before, we used the average differential from those studies. We used a study that was prepared by Reeves and Associates, who for some reason doesn't like me, and we ran the differential that they reported in their own study. And then we ran a survey that our client, MIDA in Puerto Rico, did of different food importers. And then we ran some different combinations of those scenarios. And if we can go, boom. And let me check my note here just to make sure I'm right with my numbers. Okay, we ran our selected scenario. We looked at all those different scenarios and we came up with what we thought was the best one. It wasn't the highest, it wasn't the lowest, it was toward the high end, but it was in between. And these were the differential costs that we came up with. It's 88.9% more expensive to ship containers to Puerto Rico than it would be without the Jones Act. It's about 60% more expensive to ship bulk cargo, right? Sand and grain and oil and stuff like that. And when we ran that through all of our models, we found out, go in front of the screen here, that it's costing people in Puerto Rico about $1.2 billion more. It's costing the overall economy about $1.2 billion more. Now the shipping costs represent $740 million of that. The actual costs of ocean freight represent $740. But when you go through that process of bringing in the oil, making the electricity, boom, 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 that comes out to the $2 billion. And this is Puerto Rico, right? Remember, we're talking about Puerto Rico is a tiny, tiny economy, right? Hawaii is much, much bigger than Puerto Rico. And if you look at the effects on, say, Texas, that's even much, much bigger than Hawaii. So Puerto Rico, remember, this is Puerto Rico, about half the size of Hawaii. It's costing Puerto Rico a total of over 13,000 jobs, right? If you made stuff cheaper in Puerto Rico, there'd be 13,000 more people employed. And if anyone knows anything about Puerto Rico, the economy is in the toilet there. That would be helpful. And even more importantly, $54 million more in state, in Commonwealth taxes for Puerto Rico. It's a big deal. That was our model. We ran all these different scenarios, and I'm gonna get my numbers right. It ended up costing, the Jones Act ended up costing Puerto Ricans, every individual in Puerto Rico, between about $150 and about $375 a year, right? And remember, Puerto Rico's wage rates, their average income in Puerto Rico is much, much lower than in Hawaii. And we're talking about, it could be as high as almost $400 per person. We looked at those job losses using the different scenarios. They range between about 5,000 and about 13,500, a little more than what we have here. So we think that basically the numbers on this slide represent the costs of the Jones Act to the island of to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Maybe a little higher, maybe a little lower, but it's in this realm. If we can go to the next one. Okay, I love this. This is another great phrase. I love these phrases from the 1920s. The flappers just had a lot of fun with words, didn't they? Bumping gums. When you bump your gums, you're speaking nonsense. And the other side has loved to bump their gums about the Jones Act. Now, most of the arguments that the other side makes are the same arguments that Senator Jones made in 1920, that the Jones Act is necessary for the Navy to have sea lift vessels, right, to carry the tanks to North Korea or wherever. It's necessary because the Navy wouldn't have people. There wouldn't be a merchant marine to crew such vessels, right? SIG wouldn't be able to get on one of those vessels. And without the Jones Act, there just would be no ability to construct large vessels in the US. Well, all of these are false, right? We've proven these are false. You can't construct large vessels in the US because there are no shipyards to do it. You don't have people to run the merchant marine because only 10,000 merchant mariners out there. And most of them are on things like fishing boats or the Staten Island Ferry and things like that. And the Navy, during the, somebody was telling me this yesterday, during the Gulf War, they commandeered one Jones Act ship to carry stuff. One. The rest was all carried on foreign flag ships because, they're cheaper. You do see some US government cargo moving on Jones Act vessels. Anyone see that movie Captain Phillips? Right, everyone saw that, right, with Tom Hanks. I love that guy. Captain Phillips was on a Maersk ship. Maersk is a Dutch line, but that ship was a US flagged ship, right? And it was carrying aid cargo. A lot of US aid cargo has to go on, well, all US aid cargo has to go on Jones Act, on US flagged ships. And that increases the cost for the government to provide aid. So those arguments, false. On the next one. Now they make a lot of economic arguments as well, and this is where I have a lot of fun, right? Because I make economic arguments too, and I'm really glad to see them doing it because it's their job, right? They need to make economic arguments for their position. But let's look at them. They talk about how the Jones Act supports thousands of US jobs. And in a way it does, because there are thousands of people working on ships. 10,000, we saw that. There are people working in ports. There are people working, making the 2 vessels that get made every year, or get made in the last 3 years. But those jobs would exist with or without the Jones Act. In fact, there might be even more. If I can buy more fishing vessels in Alaska, I might have a bigger trade there. By the way, you guys, I keep going back to the Deadliest Catch because I just, for some reason, I'm jet lagged and I have it on my mind. But the biggest ship on that show, where these guys are fishing up in Alaska, that ship was actually it was built for World War II. It's an old oil ship for World War II that's been converted into a fishing vessel. That's how old a lot of these vessels have to be, because you just can't build them in the United States. Okay, what else did they talk about? The Jones Act provides dedicated service, right? You guys have dedicated service because Matson they love you, and they're bringing this out of the goodness of their heart. Well, yeah, it's dedicated service because that's their job, right? That's the route they run. With or without the Jones Act, they're going to still run that route, and other vessels will run that route as well. I could start a line, buy a ship, and run that route. Evergreen can decide to run ships from from Hawaii to the West Coast. Or I guess, or Maersk Lines can run ships from New York to Hawaii. It doesn't matter. The Jones Act does not provide service. The Jones Act does not lead to service. Demand leads to service. They argued, this one, I love this. They looked at Walmart prices, and they argued that the price for cheese in Puerto Rico was the same as in Florida. Well, yeah, they're looking at Walmart, first of all, and Walmart basically prices stuff in all their stores very similarly. And it doesn't matter. Puerto Rico is a very, very poor economy, right? People don't make that much money there. So prices are generally lower in Puerto Rico than they would be in the U.S. mainland. So again, it's another relevant factor. They talk about costs. The cost for operating a foreign vessel in the U.S. would be higher. Yeah, sure. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be operating in the U.S. And frankly, the cost of operating a vessel is completely separate from the price that a line is charging to move a TEU, and I'll show you that in a second as well. And finally, they talk about how shipping costs make up a small percentage of retail price. Yeah, they do, right? If I take a TEU of beans from LA to here, I'm carrying 40,000 cans of beans, and if it costs $100 or $200 more, yeah, it's a penny a can. But again, prices add up. Those higher shipping costs lead to higher wholesale costs. Wholesalers mark up stuff. There's sales taxes on those things. All those pennies add up, and you put them all together for an economy the size of Puerto Rico's, that ended up being $1.9 billion. Okay, I'm an economist, so I have to show you a graph. This is what we do. This is our job. Everything in economics goes back to 1776, right? The years of the revolution. 1776, a guy named Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And he basically described how markets worked. And nothing has changed since 1776. There's no new, we make things more complicated. We add Greek letters to it. It's the same thing. I got supply curves, I got demand curves, and as prices go up, supply goes up. As prices go up, demand goes down. Simple fact. What the Jones Act does, like any supply restraint, is it forces, and this is simplified, but it forces prices up because I'm limiting my supply. It's very similar to, I just found out, housing prices in Maui, right? They can only put houses on 5% of the land, was it? 5%, I think, in Maui? So housing prices are really high there. New York, you can't really build houses, so housing prices are high. Same thing in San Francisco. All of these kinds of things matter. If you limit supply, prices go up. It's as simple as that graph. Next one. Okay, so now you guys are on the trolley, right? You're on the trolley. You know what we're talking about in the Jones Act. The Jones Act costs consumers and firms hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, mostly actually in the continental United States. You feel it more on an island, right? You feel it more here because more stuff has to come by water, and it's a bigger part of your costs. But Hawaii is a small economy. You look at this across the whole United States economy, it's a big cost. In Puerto Rico alone, the Jones Act costs at least $1.2 billion. It's responsible for over 13,000 fewer jobs and about 1.5, a little more in the overall economy. It reduces total tax revenues by 1.6 million. That includes federal taxes as well. And most of the arguments for the Jones Act are, I can use a term involving a male cow, but I won't. And so, simply put, it's a drag on the economy. It's something that really needs to be changed. It's hard to change laws, but hopefully meetings like this will get us started on doing that. So with that, voila, I made it, and I think I did it in 20 minutes. So.
With that said, I hope you're ready to ask some questions, and I invite you to come on up to the microphone over here. Joe will moderate you over there. I see Professor Kate Joe, a political economist at the University of Hawaii. And John, let me invite you to come on back over here to the middle in front of the screen.
Okay.
Kate, thank you for joining us today. I know that you have looked at the international protectionist aspects of the Jones Act for a long time, but you can ask anything you'd like to. Thanks for being here today.
I'm sorry, just a second. Can you hold this and stand for me?
Okay, I'm proud to say that I was the first person to inform the former president of Grassroot about the Jones Act. This is about
Dick Rowland, very good.
Yeah, Dick Rowland. 1994, I came here and I discovered the box of stereo is 3 times more than the mainland. 1994. So I discovered there's something weird going on here. So I have to go around and tell you this is Jones Act.
Well, don't buy cereal.
I think I'm the only faculty at the University of Hawaii to teach students about the Jones Act. I think besides the economic cost, there's also environmental cost. Because the shipment from China and Japan, you know, for example, you order a Toyota car, which I drive, only drive Toyota. I order from Japan, and they come to Hawaii and say goodbye. They cannot land here and go to Long Beach and come back. For each truck or each car costs Hawaiian resident $1,200. So we pay extra for that. Every one of us. Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about whether we can use the political left strategy. This is a really anti-culture because Hawaii is Asia Pacific, you know. So historically, this law was enacted before Hawaii joined the joined the Union. Okay? So we should grandfather in. People, things from the Asia Pacific should be grandfathered in because it's our tradition. You know, especially when you are the OHA leader, that I was told 80% Hawaiian people have some Chinese blood. Okay, they have tradition.
Well, that's very interesting, Kate.
Culture-wise, politically not correct. This Jones Act.
Kate, we'll go to Chinese food later on, but
Okay.
can you ask your question quickly?
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm asking the question is this, is that the political, so how can we do it in a political way? I don't know what Donald Trump's stand for this.
Great question. May I borrow your microphone? Thank you, Kate.
I wanted to show that Donald Trump.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm going to give you the microphone over here.
Okay.
Professor Joe is asking, what are some of the political considerations that are needed to bring about any kind of change or reform of the Jones Act, especially in the current political climate? And I believe you were referring to the federal climate with
Yes.
President Trump and Congress. Can you step over here just a little bit?
Yeah, I don't want to have
Thank
the
you. Go ahead.
microphone do its thing. Okay, so politics is weird. I work in government affairs. That's most of the work I do. And to get something killed is really, really easy. To get something passed is really, really hard. So you're trying to pass a repeal. You're trying to pass something new. And you have 2 congressmen and 2 senators, and Puerto Rico has none. So there's not a whole lot of congressional interest actually in the Jones Act because they don't think about it from a continental U.S. perspective.
Money from the Jones Act interest group.
Well, yeah, they get money from congressmen get money from everybody. There's interest groups on both sides of everything. That's just the way it works.
But the majority of money comes from them.
Of course, because they're making money on it. But you asked about the president. I think this is actually a really good issue for the president for 3 reasons. One, it's a monstrously costly regulation. And his thing about getting rid of regulations is real. Second, he wants to support the iron and the steel and aluminum industries. And shipbuilding is one of the largest, actually the component, if you look at the components of ships, it's one of the largest industries where steel and aluminum, is a percentage of that. And third, he's really interested in the trade deficit. And one of the unintended consequences, as you just mentioned, of the Jones Act is I'm not going to import stuff to Hawaii from the continental U.S. It's cheaper for me to get it from Taiwan or Australia or wherever just because of the differential shipping costs. So all three of those things are all in his, they're all in his court. So I think it's a good time, actually, to start making us think about this.
Very good. Thanks, John. And I'd like to add one ingredient. Ralph Benko, a national columnist, has written an interesting article, you can Google it, called "There's Not Enough Money in Politics." Now that may surprise you. What he's saying is that there's a huge amount of money in politics to keep the Jones Act in place as in the status quo. The American Maritime Partnership puts a great deal of money into political candidates, and John mentioned some of the industries that support it. But what he's suggesting is that there's not enough money from the side that wants to reform. And what it boils down to is this, that it's going to cost money in order to get the attention of members of Congress. Interesting thought. Now, we've got John Carroll at the microphone over here. Welcome, John. I know you have been a staunch opponent of the Jones Act in its present form for many, many years, former legislator and public servant for many, many years. John, go ahead and ask your question.
The money thing is exactly right, because I'm familiar with the Jones Act since 1970 when I put in the first anti-Jones Act resolution as a state representative. But the Commerce Clause is designed, apparently according to an 1801 case, to ensure that every state has equal access to interstate commerce with the states, nations, and Indian tribes. Hawaii has no pipeline, highway, or railroads, neither does Puerto Rico, and yet we are totally deprived of this constitutional right as a state. And that Troy versus the Grassroot actually dug this case up that I wish I had earlier, but it was Territory of Alaska against Troy, 1922. In any event, in that case, they pronounced all the reasons why the Jones Act was violating the Commerce Clause, and the federal judge said, well, you're absolutely right, but you're a territory, so these state protections do not apply. Wow. Unfortunately, I didn't know about that case until about 2 years ago, thanks to Grassroot. And what my question was, is do you know of what is holding everybody back from getting rid of this totally violative law, or if there's a movement going this direction? Incidentally, I talked to Mike Hansen, thinking that they had come to their senses at the Hawaii Shippers Council, but they're still talking about getting rid of the build exemption, which does absolutely nothing to correct the interstate commerce impact. I'll listen.
Thanks for your question, John. John?
That's a great question. This got brought up in Maui when I was giving this presentation too. I feel that all legislation is like a sporting event, right? It's like a football game. And there's two sides to it, and the side with the best team wins. And this is an issue that doesn't have a big team supporting the repeal. It's something that it seems to be a sort of Hawaii or Puerto Rico specific, and it's not something that's of interest to most members. You got to make this thing interesting to Jerry Nadler. You have to make this thing of interest to Ted Cruz, because it costs New York and it costs Texas a heck of a lot more than it's costing Hawaii. But it's just not on their radar. And I think that's the first step. And it's still going to take 20 years. It takes forever to repeal stuff.
That's right. Speaking of Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Mike Lee, we've had the opportunity to talk with both of them about what can be done on a federal level in order to bring about change with the Jones Act. So after catching Mike Lee up a little bit on the minutia of this law, I asked him a question. I said, what would you do in order to win over the country and bring about change on the Jones Act? And he thought about it and he said, show lots of pictures of starving Hispanic children and say, the Jones Act causes this. That's the political face we need to put on it. We have with us now Attorney Sam King. Delighted you're joining us today, Sam.
Thank you. This is a great presentation. I appreciate it. I think following up just on the kind of tone of questions about what political action can be done. Has anybody, it sounds like we've talked to some senators, which I'm hoping to hear more about. Has anyone actually talked to the administration about this concept? I mean, had a meeting with the president about it?
I have absolutely no idea.
John, you may be able to address, though, what's gone on with the intention of the administration to modify the Jones Act to aid in our transport of liquid natural gas. I think they've taken a step back from that intention.
Yeah, I think they were looking at an exemption for LNG. I actually, it's interesting, and I'm not really up on exactly what the administration did there, but I did look at exemptions to the Jones Act, because there have been exemptions. You know, just to give you an example, if you wanted to bring a big, I don't know, cracking tower for a refinery to Hawaii, you couldn't bring it from the United States because there's not a ship big enough to carry a piece of project cargo like that. So you would go to the Department of Homeland Security if you were trying to bring that thing in, and you would apply for an exemption so that you can use a foreign vessel. I looked at those exemptions, and there's hundreds of requests. Almost none of them ever get, they're almost all denied. Virtually all of them are denied. So there's something, you know, there's just something with the whole process that's wrong.
Thank you for your question, Sam, and I see you've sat down again. Our people in Washington, D.C., and some of you know Malia Blom-Hill, who works with us in Grassroot there, have told us a couple of things consistently since the election of President Trump. Number one, that Jones Act would not be, according to some of his key people, Jones Act would not be a major priority in the first term, but possibly in the second term. And again, that's not an official statement, but I've heard the very same response from people associated with Representative Ed Case, who has stood exactly where I'm standing and has expressed his desire to see a change in the Jones Act as well. Marissa Kearns, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Let me give you a hug. I haven't seen you in a while.
Yep, thank you.
Aloha.
Busy campaigning, as always.
Aloha, and I would have given John Carroll a hug as well. Go ahead, Marissa.
My name is Marissa Kearns. I'm owner of Action Shipping. I've been in shipping business here in Hawaii for 30 years. I'm the insider that kicked Maslin on their guts. I fought many bills. I fought Senate Bill 954. That was during Abercrombie. They wanted to charge us a local $52 per container coming in. So I think I'm the only one that killed that sucker. So I'm one of those that's going inside and going after them, because 3 months ago I just talked to Madison, because I always talk to Madison almost every day. You know, and I told them, you do not raise the fuel surcharge. Right now it's still 33. They were going to raise it 37.5. Picked up my phone, as always, tell them, you don't do that. We have mass out-migration in Hawaii. We can no longer afford humans.
You're right, thank
I
you.
just talked to him just like that. He's my sales guy, he's up there in Phoenix, and he got through to their line, boom.
Good.
And he added the 3.5%.
Do you have, Marissa, do you have a question for John?
Yeah. I have a question. If you're gonna go to, I don't know if you go to the CPAC or those conservatives events, because I am planning to meet Senator Ted Cruz, because I'm the caucus presidential executive director for Ted Cruz here, 2016, and I already sent out a message that we're gonna meet him up there. It's gonna be in Reno, Nevada in September. So just check if you're gonna be there. You know, I would like to bring Hawaii delegation to be us, all of us to be there. And thank you for Grassroot for, you know, bringing you over.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It was fun to come over. I'm going to be in Vegas in September. I didn't know at the CPAC meeting there. I'll take a look and see if I'll be around.
September 13th.
Let me take a look at my calendar. But yeah, Senator Cruz would be a good. I'm just going to give. Can I give a quick anecdote? One of my clients was Verizon, and Verizon was working on a bill in Texas, it was a state bill, and they said, "Oh, nobody cares about this. We're not going to get anywhere with it." And I started doing some research, and the chairman of the committee that was hearing that bill represented an area it's called the Barnett Shale. It's one of the big oil-producing areas outside of Dallas. And I went and did a little research like we did here and found out that 9 cents out of every dollar that is used to produce oil is telecommunications, right? All these oil rigs have tons and tons of telecommunications going to them. And I just mentioned to him how much it was costing the oil industry, And suddenly that bill had interest. And suddenly that bill passed. So it's all about showing these people, congressmen are not evil people. Well, some of them are evil people, but they have to deal with a lot of different things, right? You have to deal with a million things when you're a congressperson. So you have to show them, you have to bring this up as something that interests them before they're going to ever move on it.
Very good, thank you. And now former nuclear sub-engineer who's one of Hawaii's clean energy entrepreneurs, my good friend Ted Peck. Ted, good to see you today.
John, thanks for coming to your presentation. Just as a note, Puerto Rico's economy is about $120 billion a year. Hawaii's is about 80.
Oh, actually, it's small.
They're almost three times the population. So their per capita is
really low, yeah.
But their economy is big. I think your environmental approach is a good way to get traction from a carbon emissions standpoint. And I think the other way that's really interesting is the interstate, either along the East Coast or up the Mississippi, you being able to make a case that way, because as much as we think we're the center of the universe out here, like you said, 2 senators, 2 congressmen, and Puerto Rico has even less political power. But I have been in many of our federal legislators' offices, and especially in DC, their entryways, their opening office, are dominated by huge Matson ship models. And to me, that is a very ribald, clear sense of who they listen to. We'll say that. She's a lot more experience in shipping. All I know is that to ship a container from the West Coast to Shanghai cost half as much as it takes to ship it half the distance to Hawaii. That is an insane number. There's a number of other reasons why, size of vessel and so forth. My question to you is, some opponents that I've heard have said that, well, really Hawaii is really too small of an economy, so we need to have some protection for the economy for that shipping to be dedicated to Hawaii. And if we got rid of the Jones Act, then that would really hurt our access and reliability of access to goods. What kind of credibility do you have for it?
Thank you, Ted. Very good.
There's 2 questions there, and they're both really interesting. The first one, and this is, Washington, D.C. is on Interstate 95, and every time I go to a meeting in Washington, the first hour of or half hour of the conversation is, how long did it take to get to work today? Interstate 95 is the most congested highway in probably the world, definitely in the United States. And one of the reasons it's congested is all the trucks going up and down that can't go by water. So that is a really important point. To your second question, it makes that point makes zero economic sense. If I got rid of the Jones Act tomorrow, that wouldn't prevent Matson from charging what they want, right? If they're going to be the only ones that ship here, they'll still charge the same rates. If somebody else comes in, that means there's a market. So to say you need the Jones Act to protect yourself is completely insane. They're not losing money on every container.
And New York. Say New York.
And
Very
New York.
good, and New York.
No Jones Act ships go to New York.
No Jones Act ships go to New York, and it's one of the biggest parts in the world, yeah.
Very good. And now we've got Mr. Sam Somsom. Thank you for joining us today. Please come to the microphone, and with that, we'll have one more questioner right after
Yes,
you.
thank you.
Before we close. Thank you.
John, in your research, do you have an estimate of how many jobs are being protected by the Jones Act? And then how many millions of people are being affected, paying a lot high cost of goods? So if you juxtapose these two, the jobs being protected and the billions of people who are paid a lot, do you have an estimate?
The second part's easy. What is it, 316 million people in the country?
Yes.
So there's 316 million people paying because of the Jones Act. What's being protected because of the Jones Act? That's an interesting question, because honestly, the only people really being protected are the people working for these steamship lines, right? And as the point we were just talking about, just if you get rid of the Jones Act, that doesn't mean those steamship lines are going to go away, right? Tote's going to still be there, and Matson's going to still be there, and they'll still ship. They're just not going to be as profitable. So are they going to lose some jobs? Probably. When you're less profitable, you lose jobs. But that doesn't, there's going to be more jobs in the ports. There's going to be more jobs working in Hawaii because stuff's cheaper, and I can come and travel here and not spend $900 a night for a hotel. So all of those kinds of things, you know, work themselves out. But very few jobs are actually being protected by the Jones Act.
Thank you, Mr. Sansan. And we have one final questioner today. Thank you for joining us. Could you introduce yourself?
Katie Rooney with the Lupano Initiative. As someone who's probably
Welcome.
read the 12 studies that you've talked about with original data,
I'm sorry.
Me too. But I was just wondering, the analysis you did for Puerto Rico, like, what is the magnitude? Like, how much did it cost, actually?
How much
If you can tell me, yeah, like what size of the project was it to do that type of economic model development and then apply it in Puerto Rico?
Oh, to actually do, for us to actually do the work?
Yeah, like the scope budget.
I think it was about $60,000, something like that. You know, that's one of the things that's interesting is everyone thinks, nobody researches something because they like to do it, right? It's not, trust me, I went through a ton of data to do that. It's not fun. And so people will say, oh, you know, this professor said, everyone's getting paid to do their studies. That's what we do. So the fact that you're paid doesn't mean much. It's do you make your assumptions visible? Do you make your model visible? Do you make your data visible? And I'll never see anything from the shipping industry that does. They hide everything. Everything in ours is visible. So,
Thank you very much. And just to dovetail on that, Katie, thank you for introducing yourself. If the Ulupono Initiative is interested in funding some more Jones Act research, we'd love to have a dialogue. There are several projects that need to be done, and we're looking at a list of them. John is working with us on some of that, and we'll be coming out with a proposal very, very soon. But the bottom line is this: there are two things that are necessary in order to shift our thinking about Jones Act. Actually, many things. But one of them, which is very important to us as a think tank, is credible research. Right now, despite all of the dialogue about the Jones Act, there is still much more research that has to be done in order to give lawmakers and the public the data that they need. But the second thing is we need to put a face on it. And John, I think you've done a good job of talking about the way people are impacted. And I enjoy the fact that you actually are very committed to researching the costs per individual, per family, whether in Puerto Rico or whether in Hawaii. Did you enjoy listening to John Dunham today?
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Grassroot Institute, we appreciate your research and your partnership. And to all of you, aloha.